All right. So once all of your data are in CalPads for end of year, your next phase of the submission would be the certification process. So we will be discussing, the submissions, how to resolve errors, what the functionalities are that you need to expect in the certification process. So in general, here's the end of year one certification workflow. So obviously you have to submit your files for end of year one. Be aware that majority of the files are replacement type processing. When you submit files, especially CRSC, SASC, make sure that all the records are for a specific school, are in the file, or for specific for all students. If you're submitting an SASC, are included in the file. So be aware of all of those nuances in CalPads. Once you submit your files and you've gone through the initial submission validations, you've corrected all of those errors, then you move on to resolving data discrepancy errors and certification errors. Okay. You may need to use a CalPAS error list or click on the error number in the user manual to be able to determine how to resolve those errors. We will do a demo on how to resolve two of the common errors in CalPads. Third, once you've brought down your errors to zero, then that's the only time that you should be reviewing your reports, because it doesn't make sense for you to review reports if you still have errors, because those students won't be included in the reports. Okay, any record that triggers a certification data discrepancy as well as cert error won't be included on the reports you will be reviewing. So make sure all of your errors are cleared before reviewing a report. So when you review reports, since you're the CalPAS admin, right? You're the data steward. However, you're just the manager, right? You need to submit, or you need to assign or send those reports to the specific date departments who manages the data. Who are this? Your curriculum specialist, your counselors, your special education staff for those work-based learning transition programs. So submit those reports to your data stewards, and once they agree that the reports are accurate, just to protect yourself, have them sign off on a physical document, or a digital signature. And then once everyone agreed that your data is ready and accurate, you can go ahead and certify your data. The good thing about end of year one is that you only have one approval. You don't need to have a self approval, although you still need to involve your SPED folks with regards to any students who are in transition work based learning programs, right? So once you've approved, then you're officially certified for end of year one. If you are a K to 8 school and you opt not to submit a CRSC and SASC records this year for your 7 and 8 graders who are in departmentalized courses, you can go ahead and certify without submitting any data. Just be aware that all of the reports will obviously show zero counts on it. Now, if you're a K to 8 school and your 7 and 8 graders are in self-contained classes, you are still required to certify data, to certify end of year one with zero numbers on your reports. If I were you, if you are in that bucket, you only have K to 8 schools, and you see end of year one, I would certify them after this training. Okay. All right. So let's go to the CalPads demo. So again, I am in our test environment. When you certify, you have to go to certification status, right? So in here, you have the different submissions. So we go to end of year one, and this is how it looks like, right? For those who are new. So the summary, in the key elements here is the summary page, the revision status, the ability to freeze a revision, your list of errors, fatal errors that you need to resolve, and the type of errors as well. Some warnings, although there are warnings that you may ignore. However, it is important that you still look into it, because sometimes, Like this year, you have no enrollment for courses, so basically you haven't submitted any SASE file yet, right? So those types of warnings. And then of course you have your certification reports. These are the minimum reports you need to review before CalPAS allows you to certify. Okay. However, of course, you have to look at all of your students listed on the student list report to make sure that everyone is accounted for. Okay. So again, these are reports you send out to your specific data stewards. Okay. And then here's your snapshot history, which just reflects the snapshot activity that you have for the LEA since CalPAS activated the snapshots for end of year one. So this is where we normally check if you've started doing your work in CalPAS for end of year submission. All right, let's go up here. So again, as I've mentioned, your revision status, if you are new to CalPAS allows you to have multiple revision statuses. So let's say if you brought down your errors to zero and you are waiting for the confirmation from your data stewards that the reports are correct, by all means, you could check this box in review, and that would freeze this version, this revision ID. So any version, any reports associated to this that you marked in review will be frozen pending the approval of those data stewards. Okay, you do that once you bring down your errors to zero. Now, let's say you froze this and your data steward said, "Oh, we made some corrections," or someone posted something in CalPads that is not associated to end of year one, but CalPads normally runs a new snapshot revision once it detects changes in your data. CalPads will then generate a new revision status. And now, if you've checked this and you got a new snapshot revision, you will have multiple revisions here. You'll have a revised uncertified and in review status. So in the CalPAS user manual, if you go to certification status and LEA, we have this hierarchy. This represents the default status you have based on your scenario. So if you still have it on revised uncertified, obviously whenever a new snapshot generates, then you will still be on revised uncertified. And then of course, if it's in review, you will have both revised and in review, but the default would be in review. So just be aware of this nuance when trying to look at your reports and reviewing reports and changing your updating data in end of year one. So that's that. So once you've brought it down to zero, then obviously you could then certify, right? However, we have 51 errors here, right? So we need to resolve the errors, right? So the certification validation page will reflect both cert errors and certification data discrepancy errors. Okay. So you have here the SCSC, SCNR, anything that with the prefix of a file type is a certification data discrepancy, which is just data discrepancy errors that you haven't resolved yet and that got picked up by the snapshot revision. When I say data discrepancy, these are the errors that you see here under data discrepancies. Okay. So any error that you haven't fixed here that got picked up by the snapshot revision will then be reflected here. So now working with this type of errors, I would recommend just going here and looking at your most recent errors on this side of CalPads. I wouldn't work on the errors here because there is always latency in terms of when CalPads picks up any changes. So this does not represent immediately any changes that you make in CalPads. So I would rather, when correcting data or errors, go to your data discrepancy page. Okay? Because once you correct an error, it will say no record found when you click on a specific record that triggered an error. Okay? So that means you already have an initial feedback that you fixed the error. It's just a matter of waiting for CalPads to refresh itself and pick it up and update the snapshot revisions in here. Okay. All right. So once you've cleared all of these errors, as I've mentioned, you just review the reports, and then you'll have a box here that says you're signing your life away, and telling us that CalPad your data, the reports here that you've certified are accurate. So you just click on yes, and then that's the only time when the LEA approve button will be activated for you to click on. Okay, that's the general process in the certification. So let's delve into the errors. So let's just do SCSC 139E1. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, you can download the error list from the bottom of CalPads. And if you're more comfortable with looking at the error list when resolving errors, then you could download this. We currently are in 16.8. The only difference between this and the CalPad user manual version would be some additional information that you need would be missing here. So let's go to end of year one. So you have all of these errors. So these are your errors. It has the error resolution, notes, updates, what fields to look at, right? So if you're comfortable resolving errors this way, then you could refer to the CalPads error list and download it. However, I would recommend that you just click on this link here, which is the error, and it would then link to the CalPads error itself. Okay, so this is a version of the error list. However, we have additional information that we add as trainers that may help you when resolving errors. Okay. Then, of course, if this error is triggering a defect, was caused by a defect, then we will have the defect number here. So I would recommend just clicking on this, and that way you would be able to easily look at the error and resolve the error. So what is SCSC 139? So it's stating that the student course section record must have a corresponding section record. So this happens when you submitted SCSC records in CalPads, but then CalPads couldn't find a CRSC record with values that match what is in the student course section. So either number one, the course section is missing. Number two, you have the courses in there, you have the student courses, however, these fields don't match. More often than not, the culprit is the academic term code. So if let's say for any, if you said that in the CRSC it's a full year, but then on the SCSC it's semester one, then that triggers a discrepancy, right? So if we scroll here, there are three scenarios. Number one, it could be a timing issue. You probably just submitted your SCSC file together with your CRSC. At the same time, your SCSC file went through with no errors, but then your CRSC had some rejected records. And so now CalPads stop the uploading of your CRSC. So if that's your scenario, clear your CRSC errors and then upload and then wait for the CalPads data discrepancy refresh to run, and that should clear the error if it's only a timing issue. Now, if you fail to submit the actual course, then obviously you have to resubmit your CRSC file for that specific school and make sure that all of your CRSC records are included in that file. You also have to consider, did you submit SCSC records for self-contained classes? If for some reason you didn't, your SIS wasn't configured properly, and when you requested an SCSC extract, it included self-contained class grades, right? So you have your SSC for your departmentalized students, and then it included an extract for students in self-contained classes. So now you have an SSC, but then since your CRSC does not include self-contained classes, you now have an orphan SCSC file, right? SCSC records. So that's another scenario you should be aware of, and make sure it doesn't happen, because resolving those is a little bit complicated. Then, of course, as I've mentioned, the non-matching values. Okay. All right, so let's look at one example here. Okay, so I have here this student, Tabasco. Okay, so this student has this. So you have here, see how when you look at the SCSC, if these field elements, the state, course code, course name are empty, that means these records are triggering a SCSC 139E1. If I open this, you would also get that warning. So how do you resolve this? Again, I go to the error. I ask myself, did I submit the CRSC file, right? So if I did the file go through with no errors? So I go to file submission, view submission, and look at the file, right? So if it says that the file went through, then by all means the file then is in CalPads. Some other scenario is causing the error, right? So if that is the case, if you submitted the file went through, then obviously it's not a missing CRSC record, it's not a timing issue, but it's something in the values between those two records, right? So how do you then resolve that scenario? So we go to the error itself. It says here, if if the local course ID and course section ID are correctly populated in the submission, ensure that the CalPAS ODS has a course section record for the submitted course ID. So normally the anchoring, the data element anchor would be your local course ID. Okay. Once anything that's sharing the local course ID should have the same local course ID on the SCSC file. Okay. So what I do is I go back to the error, copy the local course ID, and then I go to course data, because since the data is already in CalPads, I go to course data and check if that course is even here or reported, right? So local course ID is equal to English 9. All right, so it's not there. That's odd, right? So it says here, the file went through, but English 9 isn't there. So what you need to do now is then look at the local course IDs, what's causing the issue. So number one, look for English 9. So look for the seat number for the teacher, I guess. And then, but then it turns out your local course ID here is different from the local course ID in the system. English 9 local course ID. Okay, you have that local course ID. It's the same. So you have English 9. All right, so we have English 9, but then turns out your local course ID here is 9 English. Okay, so it's English 9, 9 English, and then of course semester 2, even the course name is different. But then again, the state course code is different. So this is the reason why you have to compare what is in CalPads versus the rejected record. You could manually do this one by one in CalPads or go to the file that you use to upload to CalPads. Okay, you compare the CRSC file versus the SCSC file. And then you highlight the different field elements that are indicated here that should be the same. Right? So the reason why this failed is that the local course ID should either be English 9 or 9 English. So now you have to decide, okay, go back to your SIS and see what the naming convention should be, right? And so if they determine that this is incorrect, then obviously you have to resubmit your CRSC records with the correct local course ID values. Okay. Now, if the SCSC is incorrect, then of course go back to the file, change the local course IDs, go back to your SIS, change the local course ID. That way, this matches. All right. So once both files are in sync or have the same values, then you could resubmit those files to CalPAS, and that should correct your SCSC 139. Now for records, let's say this was really a 9 English and you have courses here. And then this one here is just essentially a orphan record, right? So for all of these records that has the 9 English, you should have not submitted this to CalPAS. How do you resolve this in a more efficient manner? You could do that by downloading the data discrepancy error extract, looking for SCSC, okay, and then request file. Go to extracts, and we have this here, right? We already have this one downloaded in my prior training, so let's download that. So the SCSC is in a text file, right? So you can open the file, however, it looks like this. So I would rather open something in Excel, okay? And then let me convert that into Excel. So you can build a file to delete the record by using this file itself and then just resubmitting a new file to CalPads without these records. My goal here is to create a delete file. That way you can do a mass delete of these records and then resubmit a new version of the SCSC records in CalPads. Okay. So see here, you have SCSC E, and then you have the different SCSC data elements, right? And then you have the errors here. So what I would do is just to highlight what the errors are. So SSC 139. So let's just delete this part here. So this is just for SSC 139. I delete this part here. So the last column should be your SCSC Carnegie earned. And then your data would be SCSC. Right? Then you have a D. So if you want to delete your orphan records, this is how you do it. You then do an SCSCD, delete all of these orphan records that you want to get rid of, and then start fresh by resubmitting your correct SCSC file. You can just submit a new SCSC file hoping that CalPAS will overwrite this. It won't because the SCSC file has some specific SSID as an operational key. Okay, so let's go here to the user manual. If you go to the CalPAS user manual and go to replacement type file, you'll see that the SCSC requires an SSID too. So if these students should not have been reported to CalPADS, then obviously you have first to do a surgical delete of those unwanted records before resubmitting a new file to CalPADS, a new corrected file, right? So that's how to do it, how to clear your SCSC 139 error. I was hoping that the SCSC, the invalid error was here, which is not. Okay, the opposite. And then another one is the student core section for SSID not enrolled during the academic year. So 681E1, let's just look at one of these records. It's stating that you submitted an SCSE record for students who was not enrolled at that specific time period. Okay, so let me just show you one here. Let's get one of these students, 6198, PE. So for this error, you have to ask yourself, student core section for SSID not enrolled during the report period. So number one, was the student supposed to be there during this time, or maybe you have inadvertently put an exit date when the student was still around, or you submitted an SCSE record stating that the student completed the course even though the student left the school before that. So for that, you have here again, turns out the student was a no-show, right? However, you submitted a course during that time, right? So now that's what now you triggered both the SCSC 681E1 as well as the SCSC 139 because obviously the student wasn't supposed to be reported, right? So if that's the case, if you only have a handful of students, I would recommend just deleting the SCSE record directly from CalPADS. Okay. Now, if this student is really enrolled this year and really completed these courses, then you have to open up the enrollment exit date to accommodate the time that the student completed this. So if let's say you have S1 or S2, then of course, by all means, make sure that you have exited the student around the last day of school, right? If it's S2. Now, if the student only completed S1 because the student left after Christmas, then make sure that you only have the academic term code of S1 here. So either way, you have to, put your critical hat on and analyze why it's causing the issue, right? So that's just some of the demo that we do for this training. If you have specific scenarios that wasn't addressed here, make sure that you send in a service ticket and we would help you with those errors.
You have completed this module. Please continue to the next video. Thank you.